The night was deep and heavy, and the forest stood under the shadow of a pale moon. Tall trees reached toward the sky like the arms of forgotten giants. The ground was covered in frost, and the air carried the sound of distant cries. But within that silence there was something unusual, something that did not belong. Predators walked the woods, their shapes sharp and cruel, their eyes glowing like cold fire in the dark. They were hunters of the highest order, creatures made to kill. They feared nothing. They stalked everything. And yet on this night, their steps slowed, and their claws sank deeper into the frozen earth as they stopped to listen. They listened to a sound that confused them, a sound that made their hearts beat faster in a way they had never known. It was laughter, human laughter, soft but steady. Strange in a place like this. The predators tilted their heads. They were used to screams. They were used to the cries of prey. But never had they heard such calm voices in the middle of a deadly forest. They moved closer, silent as shadows. And then they saw it. A fire burned in the center of a clearing, its light golden and alive. Sparks rose into the sky and danced like tiny stars. Around it sat humans, wrapped in simple cloth, speaking in low voices, their faces warm in the glow. And between them something even stranger moved. The predators saw small figures crawling forward. Not humans, not prey, but cubs of their own kind. The cubs stepped into the glow of the fire, their fur catching the light, their small eyes wide. They should have hidden. They should have snarled. They should have known to stay away from fire and strangers. But instead they walked toward the humans, as if drawn by an unseen hand. They moved without fear, and when the humans reached out with open palms, the cubs leaned closer, touching warmth with tiny claws. The hunters in the shadows froze, their jaws parted. They had ruled countless hunts and torn through countless worlds, but this they did not understand. Fear was written in every bone of prey across the galaxy, and yet their own young moved not away, but toward these fragile creatures, toward humans, toward fire, toward voices that carried no threat. One predator growled low, the sound trembling. Another pushed him back with a claw. Silence was needed. Silence was heavy. The scene was too strange, too unreal. Their instincts told them this was wrong. Their instincts told them this was danger unlike any other. Still they could not turn away. They watched as a human broke a piece of bread and placed it in small hands. They watched as the cubs chewed softly. No cries, no strikes, only calm. The fire flickered and the humans smiled. They spoke in a tongue the predators did not know. But the tone was soft, like running water, like a lullaby. And the cubs lowered themselves at the edge of the fire, curling against the earth as if they belonged there. The predators felt the weight of a new fear, a fear that spread across their kind like frost in the dark. Never had they felt small, but in that moment they did. Never had they felt hunted, but in that moment they wondered if the gaze of humans was sharper than claws, if the warmth of fire was stronger than fangs. The clearing seemed brighter than the stars above, and they dared not step closer. Their muscles were tight, their breath shallow. They whispered to one another, but none found an answer. The leader of the hunters shifted his weight, his eyes locked on the cubs. His mind could not make sense of it. He remembered old words, tales told in half-belief, stories of a species that could bend not through power, but through presence, a species that carried fire inside them, not just in their hands, but in their hearts, and in that fire others found safety, even beasts who should never bow. The silence of the clearing deepened. The predators no longer laughed as they once did. They no longer carried the pride of being feared. They now stood as shadows pressed against the weight of something unseen. And the cubs, their own cubs, leaned into the arms of humans, closing their eyes under the night sky as the fire burned brighter. The hunters did not move. Their claws dug into the frost, their teeth clenched but useless. They had lived by fear and by fear alone, but now fear belonged to them. The forest seemed to whisper that a new truth had come, a truth that made even the fiercest freeze. And so the predators stood in silence, their bodies hidden, their hearts loud, watching as the fire crackled and the cubs slept beside the humans. And though no word was spoken between the hunters and the strangers, the meaning was clear. The age of fear was shifting, and it began with the firelight that held the night still. The shadows held the hunters in their cold grip, and the forest seemed to breathe with them as they watched the fire burn brighter in the clearing. Every flicker of flame, felt like a strange heartbeat against the silence. The predators shifted uneasily. Their claws sank into the frozen soil. Their breath came in misty clouds. Yet none dared to move forward. None dared to claim the young that had slipped from their dens and wandered into the light of strangers. These were not ordinary strangers, for ordinary prey trembled at the sound of the hunter's approach. Ordinary prey fled at the first scent of danger. But these beings did not run. They sat at the fire calmly, their hands stretched toward warmth, their voices weaving sounds that carried no fear, their faces unbroken by dread. They were humans, fragile to the eye, weak in the body, yet something around them bent the laws of instinct, and the predators could not understand it. One hunter, smaller but fierce, leaned toward the leader and whispered with a hiss that cut through the cold, "The cubs are ours. They should cry out for us. They should resist the touch of outsiders. Why do they lean closer instead? Why do they sit at the fire as if they were born to it? Why do they choose the arms of strangers over the safety of their own kind?" The leader gave no answer, for no answer came. Only silence pressed upon him like weight. The hunters shifted again, their tails lashing, their bodies restless. They were born to conquer. Their kind never stopped to question the nature of prey. Prey was food. Prey was fuel. Prey was everything below them. But tonight they questioned. Tonight they doubted. Tonight they felt something that made their pride crack. And it was not the fire itself. It was what the fire meant when wrapped in human presence. It was the bond that grew between predator cub and human hand. It was the strange silence where no fear lived. The smaller hunter hissed again. "Let us strike now before the night grows older. Let us tear through them before the cubs forget who they belong to." But the leader raised a claw, and the words fell quiet. The leader's gaze stayed locked on the scene before him, the fire reflected in his eyes. The humans laughed softly as one of the cubs stumbled into a lap. The human held it gently, stroking its head, and the cub purred. The sound was soft but carried through the night, like a thunder that no storm could match. The hunters froze, their spines stiff, their ears pulled back, for never had they heard their young purr for another. Never had they seen such surrender. Fear spread, though none wished to name it. They were hunters, and fear was not for hunters. Fear was for the weak. Fear was for prey. Yet the taste of it filled their mouths like ash. The forest seemed brighter, and the shadows seemed thinner. They tried to whisper courage to themselves, but every spark of fire told them they were wrong. Something larger was moving here, something beyond claws and fangs, and they stood on the edge of it. One hunter asked, "Why do the cubs not fear them?" Another answered, "Perhaps the humans cast a spell. Perhaps their fire is a trick. Perhaps the warmth blinds the little ones." The words were desperate, clinging to anything that made sense. But in their hearts they knew it was not spell work. It was not trickery. It was something simpler, something they did not possess, something they could not crush. It was the calm the humans carried into the night. The leader felt the truth more than the rest. He had led many hunts. He had broken the courage of worlds. He had laughed in the face of defenses. But tonight the laughter was gone. He stared and saw his own cubs curl against humans. He saw them fall into sleep without claws drawn, without teeth bared, and he knew a line had been crossed, a line that no predator could push back. The hunters argued in whispers that hissed like snakes. Strike now. End them before dawn. Yet none moved, for to move meant to challenge what stood in the firelight, and none wished to test it. Even the boldest found his legs heavy, his chest locked. The fire crackled again, and they flinched, ashamed but powerless. One whispered of old tales, words carried by the oldest mothers, stories that spoke of a fire inside humans, a fire no water could drown, a fire no beast could silence, a fire that gave warmth even to those who should hate it. The others hissed at the tale, but none denied the thought. Confusion ruled them. They were predators, and predators were built on certainty. They knew their place. They knew the fear they gave. They knew the weakness of others, but now weakness did not appear in the clearing. Weakness had been replaced with something untouchable. Humans were fragile, but fragile things broke. And here they did not break, they glowed. The cubs shifted in their sleep, small bodies pressed against the strange warmth. The hunters watched in silence as their own blood turned to loyalty for another. And they could not move. They could not roar. They could only whisper among themselves, "Why, why, why?" And every why cut deeper into their pride. Every Y built a wound that claws could not heal. The leader breathed deeply, his chest heavy with knowledge. He wanted to deny what he saw, but the truth was too large. The humans had done nothing but sit, but their sitting broke the natural order. Their calm shattered the walls of fear. Their presence bent the wild into peace, and the hunters who never bent felt themselves bow in spirit. Though their heads never lowered, though their claws never touched earth in surrender, their hearts bent anyway. The forest grew colder, but the fire grew warmer. The hunters stepped back without command, their bodies shrinking into shadows, their eyes wide with something nameless, and still the cubs slept in safety. The leader turned at last, and his tail swept the snow behind him, his voice low and heavy with confusion. Perhaps we are not the only hunters. Perhaps something else hunts deeper than fangs. Perhaps the fire is not flame, but something older. And he left the clearing. The others followed, silent and broken by thought. Behind them the forest closed again, but the sound of human laughter echoed faintly through the trees, chasing them farther and farther into the dark. And though no word was carved into their memory, each hunter carried the same scar, the scar of not knowing, the scar of confusion, the scar of fear unspoken, and that scar would spread across their kind like a shadow. The night would remember it, the cubs would remember it, and above all, the predators would never forget the moment they froze. Not before claws, not before weapons, but before the firelight of humans. And so confusion became the first seed of a new legend. One whispered through teeth that once laughed, but now only clenched. A legend that would grow with every retelling. A legend that said humans carried something no predator could ever crush. A legend born in the silence of that night. The night did not end quickly, and the hunters who had pulled back into the safety of the dark remained restless as they lingered among the trees. Their eyes glowed with unease as the fire burned stronger in the clearing. Each crack of wood carried an echo, like a heart beating against the silence. The air was filled not with the smell of blood as it should have been, but with the warm scent of smoke and bread and peace. It was wrong to them. It was terrifying in its quiet. The humans sat around the fire as if they owned the forest, their hands stretched toward the warmth, their faces soft and calm, their voices weaving a low hum like a psalm. They were fragile things to the eyes of the hunters, soft skin, weak muscles, no claws, no sharp teeth, no armor or weapons, only cloth and flame. Yet the cubs of the hunter's own kind moved closer and closer, as if these fragile beings were protectors, as if the glow of their fire was safer than the dens that had raised them. One human broke the bread into small pieces. The hands were gentle as they reached toward the cubs. One cub tilted its head and sniffed, then accepted, chewing with tiny teeth. Another human smiled and held out a small bowl of warm broth. The cub licked eagerly and purred with a sound that made the hunters in the shadows tremble. It was the sound of trust, the sound that belonged to family, but it was given to strangers. It was given to humans. The leader of the hunters pressed a claw into the frozen soil. His mind burned with disbelief. How could such a thing be? How could the instincts of the young betray them so easily? The hunters had ruled worlds. Their name whispered in terror across stars. No creature had ever stood against them without trembling. But here their own blood found comfort in the arms of the fragile. The hunters whispered among themselves. Perhaps it was trickery. Perhaps humans had stolen the scent of mothers. Perhaps they had poisoned the air with secret smoke. Yet the leader knew in his heart it was not so. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. The truth was that humans carried something unseen, something that did not show in the claw or the tooth or the muscle, something that lived inside them, something that reached outward like invisible fire. The cubs felt it and moved toward it. The hunters felt it and stepped back. It was not strength of body. It was not sharpness of weapon. It was a warmth that pulled the wild into calm. It was the strange gift that made humans more than prey, and yet not predator either. It was something else. Entirely. The smaller hunter hissed in anger. We should rush them now. Tear through their flesh. Claim the cubs. End this madness before it spreads. But the leader only shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the fire. He had seen courage before. He had seen prey fight back with teeth and blades. He had seen last stands and desperate roars. But this was not courage born of desperation. This was something deeper. This was calm that could not be broken. The humans did not sit with fear in their eyes. They did not tremble waiting for death. They simply existed as if the night itself belonged to them. And the cubs believed it. The cubs accepted it. And that was power beyond anything the hunters had known. The fire snapped and threw sparks into the air. One of the cubs reached up with small claws, trying to catch the glowing embers as they rose. The humans laughed gently and guided the paw away. They whispered words that the hunters could not understand, but the sound was like water over stone. It smoothed the edge of the night. It carried peace into the ears of the cubs, and even the hunters felt their own breath slow against their will. One growled to remind himself of his nature, but even that growl felt weaker. The leader remembered old whispers, legends told in half-belief, that there was a species who carried not claws, but fire inside, that their fire was not the kind that burned forests, but the kind that lit hearts, that beasts drawn to them found themselves quiet, that even enemies felt weight in their presence. He had dismissed the tales as foolish words of elders who feared change, but now as he watched his cubs rest in safety against the lapse of humans, he wondered if the tales were true, if he was seeing the proof that had been doubted for ages. The other hunters tried to make sense of it. They argued in low tones. Perhaps it is the light of the fire. Perhaps it is the sound of their voices. Perhaps it is the warmth of food. Perhaps the cubs are too young to know fear. But every explanation crumbled because the hunters themselves felt the same weight. They themselves felt the same pull. They had never admitted fear before. They had never allowed doubt into their bones. But tonight it was there, alive and sharp, and it came not from weapons or numbers. It came from something as simple as a hand extended toward a cub. The humans sat without threat, but the absence of threat was its own kind of power. The hunters understood battle. They understood the roar and the strike. They understood the rush of claws and the fall of prey. But this was not battle. This was something beyond battle. It was peace stronger than violence, and that peace made the hunters afraid in a way they could not fight. The cubs began to close their eyes. The fire crackled steady. Their small bodies leaned into the warmth. Their tiny purrs filled the night, and the hunters felt a strange twist in their hearts, for they knew that once the cubs tasted this warmth, they would never fear humans again. They would never look upon humans as prey or enemy. They would see them as something else, something unknown, and that unknown was dangerous because it broke the order that had ruled the galaxy. The leader lowered his head, his breath heavy. He spoke to the others with voice low and rough. Humans are not what we thought. They are not prey. They are not weak. They are something different. And what is different cannot be measured by our claws. What is different cannot be weighed by our teeth. The others hissed in denial, but none dared to strike. None dared to test the firelight. The night grew colder. The stars wheeled above. But the fire burned on, steady and alive. And the secret of humans glowed in its center. Not a secret of weapons. Not a secret of strength. But a secret of warmth, of calm, of presence. A secret that drew the cubs closer. A secret that froze the hunters in confusion and silence. A secret that would not be forgotten. For once learned, it could never be unseen, never be unheard, never be undone. And so the hunters stood, trapped between their pride and their fear, trapped between the world they had ruled and the new truth rising before them. The human secret was not shouted. It was not carved in battle. It was simple and quiet, and yet it shook the night more than thunder. And the predators who had laughed at fear could no longer laugh at all. The night was long and the cold deepened as the forest grew still. Frost spread over branches, and every breath of wind carried ice through the air. Yet the clearing remained bright and warm. The fire crackled and hissed as it burned, its flames reaching high as if alive. It was not just wood that burned. It was something greater, something unseen, and the hunters who lingered in the shadows could feel it pressing against them like an unseen hand that refused to let them pass. The cubs of their kind curled close to the humans, their small bodies trembling not with fear, but with peace, their eyes heavy with sleep, their ears pressed flat against warmth. They should have cried for their mothers. They should have resisted the touch of strangers. Yet they leaned into human arms without thought. The hunters stared with eyes wide, unable to make sense of the scene. Their claws twitched, but they did not move. Their instincts shouted to strike and reclaim the young, yet another force pulled them back. Another weight pressed harder than instinct. The fire glowed brighter, and every spark carried light into the dark. The hunters felt as if each spark was a watchful eye, as if each ember was alive. They stepped back without meaning to, their bodies moving against their own will. The leader narrowed his eyes, his chest tight, for he felt the power was not in the flame alone, but in the bond that wrapped around the flame. The humans and the cubs together made a circle stronger than claws, stronger than teeth, stronger than any pack of hunters. And the fire was the heart of it. The smaller hunter growled with anger, his voice a hiss of defiance. We are the strongest in this world. Nothing stands before us. We cannot fear a weak flame. Yet his body shook. His claws dug deep into the frozen soil, and his tail lashed not with pride but with unease. The leader looked at him and spoke low. It is not the flame that stops us. It is what lives within it. The smaller hunter snarled but offered no answer, for his eyes betrayed the same fear he denied. The humans spoke in their soft tongue, their voices low like streams running over stone. The cubs listened, their purrs rising and falling with the rhythm. The hunters strained their ears. Though they could not understand the words, they felt the meaning. The voices carried calm. The voices carried safety. The voices carried a promise that no predator could break. And the hunters trembled, for they had never known words to be sharper than claws. Yet here words cut through the night without. Strike or roar. The leader remembered the whispers of legends told long ago. Stories of a fire that was more than heat. A fire that protected those who stood near it. A fire that turned away darkness. He had laughed at those stories once. He had thought them weak illusions. But now as he stood in the shadow, he could feel the truth. The fire was more than flame. It was shield and spear. It was heart and spirit. And it belonged to the humans, who carried it with them. The hunters argued in quiet tones. Some said strike now before dawn. Others said wait and watch. Others said flee while there is still time. Yet none stepped forward. None dared test the circle of flame. One predator stretched a paw forward into the light. But as the glow touched his fur, he felt a burning inside his chest. Not pain of flesh, but pain of spirit. He pulled back with a cry that rattled through the trees. And the others shrank farther away. The fire did not burn his body, but it had burned his courage. It had burned the pride that lived inside. The humans looked toward the shadows for a moment, their eyes calm and steady. They did not rise. They did not reach for weapons. They only watched, and in that watching the hunters felt seen. They felt stripped of their power. The gaze of humans was not sharp, but it was deep. It cut without claw. It pierced without tooth. And the hunters turned their eyes away, unable to meet it, ashamed to be seen as they truly were, creatures who feared the light. The fire roared higher, as if answering the cold, as if pushing back against the night. The cubs shifted in their sleep, but did not wake. They trusted the warmth. They trusted the arms that held them. The hunters whispered among themselves that something unnatural was happening, that no young of their kind should trust so easily, that no fire should carry such weight. But the leader knew better. He knew it was not unnatural, it was human, and human was something they could not measure. The leader spoke again, his voice low and heavy. If we strike now, we will not win, not because they are stronger in body, not because they hold sharper weapons, but because they hold something else, something we cannot break. The others hissed in denial. They called him coward. They called him weak. But none dared move forward. Their bodies betrayed their words. Their hearts betrayed their pride. They all knew he spoke truth. The night stretched on, and the hunters grew restless. Yet still they could not act. The fire was a barrier, not of flame but of presence. Every moment they stood there they felt smaller. Every breath they took made the air heavier. They could not explain it, but they felt it. The humans were different. The fire was different. And the cubs who slept safe in that circle were proof of it. Proof that the old order was breaking. Proof that fear no longer ruled as it once had. One by one the hunters began to step back, their eyes wide, their bodies tense. They turned into the dark, unwilling to face the fire any longer. The leader lingered, his gaze locked on the humans who sat with calm faces. He saw the cubs breathing in peace. He saw the fire steady and alive, and he knew this night would be remembered. He knew this night had carved a scar into the pride of his kind, a scar that would not fade. Passed and followed his hunters, his heart heavy with confusion and fear. The fire behind them still burned, its glow reaching through the trees long after they vanished into the dark. It was more than flame. It was a sign. It was a shield. It was the fire that protects. And the predators, who had once laughed at fear, now carried it in silence. And though they tried to forget, though they tried to bury the shame, they knew they never would, for the fire would live in their memory forever. The forest grew colder as the night stretched on, and yet the clearing remained alive with warmth and calm. The fire burned steady, its flames reaching high as if they carried voices of their own. The cubs slept in peace against the humans who watched over them, and the hunters in the shadows trembled in silence, their pride heavy, their claws restless, their hearts caught between rage and fear. None of them had ever faced such a choice before. None of them had ever felt so weak before something that held no weapon. The boldest hunter among them growled low, his eyes burning with anger, his body leaning forward into the light. He hissed to the others that this was madness, that their kind was being stolen, that their cubs were being turned away from them. And he declared that he would not stand and watch. He would step into the clearing. He would prove that humans were fragile. He would prove that fire was nothing. But as he took a step forward, the cubs stirred in their sleep, and one of them lifted its small head and let out a growl. It was not a growl meant for humans. It was not a growl meant for fire. It was a growl meant for him, for the predator who sought to strike, and the sound made his blood run cold. He stopped, his paw frozen in midair, his heart pounding with shame. The cub had chosen. The cub had stood not for its kind, but for the strangers who held it close. The cub had chosen humans, and that choice carried more weight than any strike could. The hunters whispered in shock, their voices sharp like breaking ice. How could the cubs defend outsiders? How could they turn against their own blood? But deep inside they knew. The cubs had tasted warmth. The cubs had felt safety, and once tasted such things could not be forgotten. No fear could break them away. No claw could tear them free. The cubs had found something beyond instinct, something that tied them closer to humans than to their own kind, and the hunters hated it. Yet they also feared it. The leader watched in silence, his mind torn. He saw the bold hunter step back with eyes wide. He saw the cub lower its head again into the arms of the human, and he understood what it meant. Humans had no claws, no fangs, no armor, yet they had won the loyalty of those who should never bow. They had won not by strike, but by presence, and that victory was something even the fiercest predator could not undo. He spoke softly to the others. What you see now is the truth. Humans do not take with force, they give, and in giving they gain more than fear ever gave us. The others hissed, their pride burning. They tried to deny it. They said the cubs were weak. They said the fire had poisoned their minds. They said the humans had cast tricks in the night. But their words rang hollow. They themselves felt the same pull. They themselves felt the same dread. They themselves felt the same weight pressing against their hearts. They knew the leader spoke truth, though they wished it were lies. They wished to laugh, but laughter no longer came, for fear had taken its place. The fire glowed brighter and brighter, as if answering their whispers. The sparks leaped high into the night. The air seemed alive with energy. The cubs breathed steady, their small chests rising and falling in rhythm with the crackle of flame. The humans sat calm, their eyes soft, their voices low, and the predators in the shadows felt as if the whole world had turned against them, as if their claws were useless, as if their fangs were dull, as if their fear was now their only weapon, and even that weapon cut only themselves. The bold hunter shook with fury, his pride wounded deeper than any claw could cut. He roared low, but the sound was weak. It carried no power. The forest did not shake. The humans did not flinch. The cubs did not stir, and the silence that followed was louder than his roar. He lowered his head in shame, his body heavy, his tail limp, and the others turned their eyes away, for they too had felt the weakness of their voice against the strength of silence. The leader stepped forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the fire, his claws sunk into the frost, his words slow and heavy. We are predators. We have lived on fear. We have ruled with fear. Yet tonight fear has turned. It is ours. It is not theirs. We face a choice. We can strike and be broken, or we can turn away and live with shame. Either way, we are no longer the masters of this night. The others lowered their heads. They had no answer, for his words carried the weight of truth. The choice pressed heavy on them. It was not just a choice of this night. It was a choice of what their kind would become. If they struck and failed, the legend would spread faster than their claws could silence. If they fled, the legend would still grow, for whispers of fear always grow. The fire was more than flame now. It was story, and stories travel farther than hunters, farther than claws, farther than teeth. Stories burn into the hearts of all who hear them, and this story had already begun. The cubs shifted again. One of them reached with tiny paws toward the face of a human. The human smiled and leaned close. The cub purred softly. The sound rolled across the clearing like thunder disguised as peace, and the hunters felt it shake them deeper than any storm. The leader closed his eyes for a moment, his breath heavy. He knew then that the choice was no longer theirs. The choice had been made the moment the cubs stepped into the firelight. The choice belonged to them, and they had chosen humans. The hunters backed away slowly, their bodies stiff, their pride shattered. The boldest among them growled again, but his voice broke into silence. The leader turned and led them deeper into the forest, his tail dragging against the frost, his mind heavy with the truth that he could not change. The fire had beaten them, not with flame but with presence, not with heat but with peace. The fire had protected not by burning but by drawing. It had drawn the cubs, it had drawn their loyalty, and it had drawn the fear of hunters into the open. Behind them the fire burned steady, its glow painting the trees gold, its crackle carrying like distant drums. The humans sat still, the cubs safe, the forest alive with something unseen. The hunters vanished into the shadows, but they carried the weight of what they had witnessed. They carried the scar of fear turned against them. They carried the shame of weakness, and they carried the knowledge that humans were no longer prey. Humans were something greater, something that even the fiercest predator could not crush. The night would end, dawn would rise, frost would melt, but the memory of that choice would never fade. For once fear changed hands, it never returned. Once loyalty was given, it never broke. And once fire became more than flame, it could never be unseen. The predators who laughed at fear had lost their laughter. They now lived with silence. They now lived with doubt. They now lived with the truth that humans carried something they could never take, and that truth was more dangerous than claws. And so the choice of fear was made, and the hunters walked away. But the legend had already begun. The forest stood silent, and the shadows clung heavy to the trees as the hunters lingered. They had stepped back from the clearing, yet their eyes were still drawn to the fire. The flame burned bright, and the smoke curled upward like a silent prayer. The cubs lay close to the humans, their small bodies pressed into warmth, their tiny breaths steady. The hunters watched and felt unease coil tighter around their hearts. They had turned away once, but still they could not leave. Still they could not break their gaze from the strange circle of light. The leader stood taller than the rest, his eyes fixed not on the cubs but on the humans. He studied their faces, the way the glow lit their skin, the way their eyes shone calm even in the deep cold of the night. He had faced countless prey across stars and worlds. He had stared into eyes filled with terror, into eyes filled with rage, into eyes filled with despair. Yet never had he seen eyes like these. Eyes that did not break, eyes that did not beg, eyes that did not fear. They were steady, they were calm, and they carried something that claw and tooth could not touch. The boldest hunter whispered sharp into the dark, "We should test them. We should strike. We should crush them before dawn." Yet his voice shook though he tried to hide it. The leader gave no answer. He only raised his head higher. His gaze locked on one human in particular. The human lifted his face toward the shadows as if he felt their eyes. His gaze swept across the forest, and then his eyes met theirs. The hunters froze, their muscles locked, their breath caught in their throats. They had faced roars and flames. They had faced walls of iron and storms of fire. Yet never had they faced a gaze like this. It was not sharp like a blade. It was not heavy like a hammer. It was calm, steady, unbroken, and it reached into them deeper than any strike could. They felt as if the human gaze stripped them of the pride they carried, stripped them of the power they thought unshakable. They felt small, they felt seen. They felt as if their own shadows betrayed them. The smaller hunter hissed low, "Turn away. Do not meet their eyes." Yet none could move. The gaze held them. The gaze bound them. It was not force, yet it was stronger than force. It was not pain, yet it burned deeper than pain. It was the weight of being measured and found lacking. It was the weight of being seen without fear, and they could not endure it. The fire snapped and sparks leapt into the sky. The cub stirred and nestled closer to the humans. The gaze of the human did not waver. He did not speak. He did not rise. He simply looked. And that simple act was enough to drive the hunters back a step. Their tails lowered. Their claws dug weakly into the frozen earth. They tried to snarl, but their voices broke before leaving their throats. The leader clenched his jaw, yet he too stepped back, his pride heavy, but his heart heavier. The gaze shifted from one hunter to another, calm, slow, piercing. It was as if the human saw not only flesh, but the spirit within, as if he knew the fear they carried, as if he understood the shame they tried to hide. The hunters felt naked beneath those eyes. They felt as if the forest itself had turned to watch them, as if the stars above leaned closer to bear witness. They trembled and could not stop. They had never bowed before another being. Yet in that moment they bowed inside, though. Their bodies tried to resist. The bold hunter tried again to step forward, his pride burning, his rage boiling. But when the gaze touched him, he faltered. His chest tightened. His breath failed. His paw froze in the air, and he collapsed to one knee. The others turned their heads in shame, for the truth was clear. Even the boldest could not withstand the gaze. Even the strongest could not hold against calm, and the fire seemed to burn brighter in answer to his weakness. The leader closed his eyes for a breath, then opened them again, and he felt the truth cut into him like no claw ever could. Humans did not need to roar to command. Humans did not need to strike to conquer. Their gaze alone carried weight beyond battle. Their gaze carried a fire that burned through pride and fear alike, and that fire was more dangerous than any weapon, for it did not end when the strike ended. It lived on in memory. It lived on in story. It lived on in the hearts of those who had felt it. The hunters pulled back farther into the trees, their bodies heavy with shame, their pride cracked. Yet still they looked back once more. The human gaze followed them even as distance grew. They felt it burning into their minds. They felt it shaping something new within them. They hated it. They feared it. But they could not forget it. The cubs slept in peace. The fire roared against the cold, and the humans sat still as if the whole forest belonged to them. The leader turned at last, his tail dragging through frost, his voice low and rough. "We cannot fight this. Not with claw, not with tooth, not with rage. Their power is not of body. It is of spirit, and spirit cannot be broken." The others growled in protest. They said no power could not be broken. Yet their voices rang hollow, for they all felt the same truth. They all knew the weight of the gaze. They all carried the wound of being seen. The night grew deeper. The stars wheeled above. The hunters vanished one by one into the shadows. Yet even as they left, the gaze followed them. It lived in their minds. It burned in their hearts. It tore into the walls of pride they had built for ages. And it would remain. It would remain long after the fire died, long after the forest slept, long after the dawn rose, for some wounds never heal, and this wound was not of flesh but of spirit. The humans spoke softly once more, their words like flowing water, their faces calm. The cubs rested safe in their arms, the fire glowed steady, and the clearing seemed untouched by fear. Yet in the forest the hunters whispered. They whispered of the gaze that broke them. They whispered of eyes that stripped them bare. They whispered of the night. They froze not by claw or by blade, but by being seen. And their whispers would spread. Their whispers would turn to legend. Their whispers would carry across worlds. The leader walked with heavy steps, his mind filled with silence, his pride shattered. Yet deep inside he understood the truth. Their kind had ruled through fear, but fear had been taken from them. Their kind had thrived on pride, but pride had been broken. Humans had given them a new law without strike or roar. Humans had given them the law of gaze, the law of spirit, the law of fire unseen, and that law would not fade, it would grow. And so the night ended with silence heavy in the forest. The fire burned still. The cubs dreamed in safety. The humans watched with calm eyes, and the hunters fled into darkness, carrying wounds that no healing could close. The wound of the human gaze. The forest slowly gave way to the first light of dawn as shadows thinned and frost began to glisten beneath the rising sun. The hunters had fled into the night carrying shame and fear, yet their hearts still echoed with the fire and the gaze they could not escape. And though they wished to bury the memory deep, it followed them like a scar across their spirit, unhealed and unhealable, for some truths once seen cannot be hidden. Some wounds once carved cannot be sealed. In the clearing the fire still burned low, its smoke curling into the pale sky. The humans sat in silence, their faces calm, their hands resting gently on the cubs who slept in peace. The cubs had chosen without words. They had chosen warmth. They had chosen safety. They had chosen the presence of humans, and that choice would echo far beyond this night. For once young ones choose, the world itself bends to that choice, and the predators who once believed themselves masters of all now knew they were no longer feared as before. The leader of the hunters walked far ahead of his pack, his steps heavy, his eyes dark, his thoughts restless, his pride broken. He remembered the fire that glowed against his skin. He remembered the cubs curling without fear. He remembered the gaze that pierced his heart. And he knew his kind would speak of this night, whether in whispers of shame or cries of warning. They would not forget. The forest itself would not forget. The stars above would not forget, for humans had marked themselves upon the story of predators. The others argued as they walked. Some said the night was trickery. Some said the cubs were weak. Some said the humans used strange powers hidden in their flame. Yet their voices shook, their words hollow, and each time they spoke of humans their eyes turned away. They could not deny what they had seen. They could not erase what they had felt. And the leader did not speak, for he knew the truth was larger than lies. The truth was heavier than denial, and silence carried more weight than their hollow words. In the clearing the humans stirred. The fire dimmed. The cubs yawned and blinked their small eyes at the rising sun. One cub rubbed its head against the arm of a human. Another reached with tiny claws toward the light of dawn. The humans smiled softly. They whispered gentle words, and the cubs listened as if the words belonged to them, as if they were born to hear them. The forest itself seemed to pause, watching the bond grow deeper, and the wind carried the scent of warmth farther than the trees, farther than the hills, farther than the reach of the hunters who fled. As the sun rose higher, the predators hid in their dens, their bodies trembling, their minds restless. They spoke to each other in broken voices. They told the tale of the fire and the gaze, each word heavy, each memory sharp, and their cubs listened, wide-eyed and silent. Their cubs did not understand why fear now lived in the hearts of their elders, but they felt it, and in feeling it they began to ask questions, questions no predator had ever asked before, questions about humans, questions about fire, questions about fear. The leader sat alone at the edge of a frozen river, his reflection broken by ripples, his claws dipped in the cold water, and he whispered to himself, "They are not prey. They are not weak. They are something else, something we cannot crush, something we cannot silence. The fire is theirs, and the fire protects." And he felt the words burn in his chest as if they were carved there. He knew these words would not remain his alone. He knew others would speak them. He knew the tale had already begun. In villages of hunters far across the forest, whispers spread, whispers that grew as they traveled from mouth to mouth. They spoke of a night where cubs betrayed their kind and chose humans instead. They spoke of fire that glowed brighter than claws could strike. They spoke of eyes that stripped the soul bare. Whispers carried fear. Whispers carried awe. Whispers carried confusion. And confusion turned to legend. For when predators cannot explain what they fear, they turn it into story. And stories never die. The humans did not know the full weight of what had begun. They only sat by the fire, sharing bread and warmth, offering safety to small lives. Yet their simple act had broken the order of a galaxy. Their calm had shattered the pride of hunters. Their presence had bent the wild into peace. And though they did not speak of legend, legend was already being written, not with ink or stone, but with memory, with whispers, with fear. As the day grew brighter, the humans gathered their things. They lifted the cubs gently and carried them away from the clearing, walking slowly through the frost-covered woods, their voices soft, their steps steady. The cubs nestled close, without struggle, without fear. The forest watched them pass. The trees swayed as if bowing. The sky opened with light, and the hunters who dared to watch from far away lowered their eyes, unable to meet the sight, the weight of what they saw. The leader spoke to his kind once more, his voice rough but steady. "We have lived by fear. We have thrived by fear. But fear is no longer ours. It belongs to us now, not to them. We have laughed at fear, But tonight fear has laughed at us, and his words cut deep into the pack, for none could deny them, none could fight them, and silence followed, silence heavier than claws, silence heavier than roars, silence that carried truth. And so the story spread. It spread beyond the forest, beyond the mountains, beyond the stars. It spread into the hearts of all who heard it. A story of humans who carried fire, not in hand but in spirit. A story of cubs who chose warmth over blood. A story of predators who froze in silence before a gaze that did not break. And this story became legend. Legend that traveled faster than ships. Legend that outlived battles. Legend that planted seeds in every heart that heard it. The predators who once laughed at fear now trembled in shadows. They trained their young with sharper claws, with stronger roars. Yet in their training they whispered warnings. Do not test the firelight of humans. Do not meet their gaze. For no claw cuts it, no tooth breaks it, and no roar silences it. The cubs listened, and their eyes widened. And though fear was meant to control them, curiosity grew instead. For curiosity is stronger than chains, and curiosity carried them closer to the legend. The humans walked on, their fire carried with them, their calm unchanged. They did not know the size of what they had done, yet they would learn in time. For legends grow roots, and roots crack the earth. Legends grow wings, and wings carry across the stars. And the legend born this night was not one that would fade. It was one that would shape the future. It was one that would change the galaxy. It was one that began with a fire and ended with silence. And so the legend begins, the legend of humans who turned fear against those who ruled by it. The legend of humans whose fire drew cubs closer. The legend of humans whose gaze stripped predators bare. And this legend will be told as long as stars burn, as long as forests breathe, as long as cubs are born, and as long as hunters remember the night they froze in silence before the fire that protects.